For the first time in years, Max Verstappen is not the easiest driver on the grid to explain. That sounds strange because the public version looks simple. Max is not dominating anymore. The driver who once made Formula One weekends feel almost automatic has started 2026 with a very different scorecard. 6th in Australia, a DNF in China, 8th in Japan. 5th in Miami, then 3rd in Canada. That is not domination. But that is exactly why this version of Max is more watchable. Because when Red Bull had the fastest car, the story was clean. Max got to the front, controlled the race, protected the tires, managed the gap, and Formula One moved on. The driver and the car looked like one machine. Now they do not. Now every result has a second meaning. The official result tells you where Max finished. The deeper question is what that result says about Red Bull. That is the uncomfortable part. This is not a story about Max suddenly forgetting how to drive. There is no evidence for that. The more grounded version is sharper. Red Bull is no longer giving him the kind of platform that makes winning look inevitable. And once that happens, Max becomes easier to measure. Not as a champion cruising in clean air, as a driver trying to pull results out of a car that no longer controls the sport. That is why Canada matters. 3rd place was Red Bull's first podium of the season. It was a real step forward, but it was not a clean reset of the story, because the result disappeared from the old Red Bull pattern, and the comparison did not. The first warning came in Australia. Max finished 6th, not a disaster, not a collapse, but also not the kind of opening statement Red Bull used to make when it had a car that could take control from the first weekend. That detail matters because early season results shape the political story inside Formula One. A 6th place for some teams is progress. For Red Bull with Max Verstappen, it immediately raises a different question. Is this just a difficult start, or is the competitive order really moving away from them? Then China made the question harder to avoid. Max did not finish the race. The issue was reported as a coolant fault, and after that weekend, Red Bull's Laurent Mekies admitted the package had significant shortcomings. That phrase matters because it does not sound like a team pretending everything is fine. It does not prove panic. It proves the team knew the problem was bigger than one unlucky result. Now the story had 2 layers. Pace was one problem, reliability was another. And for a driver like Max, that changes the meaning of every weekend. Because if the car cannot consistently deliver performance, Max is no longer racing only against Mercedes, Ferrari, and McLaren. He is racing against the ceiling of his own package. Then came Japan, 8th place. That result is important because Japan is not just another line on a results table. It is the kind of circuit where a strong Red Bull package once looked brutally efficient. Fast corners, balance, confidence, tire control. The things that used to make Red Bull look like it had answers before everyone else had questions. But in 2026, Japan did not give Red Bull authority. It gave them a visible ceiling. That is when the public story started changing. This was no longer just Max missing wins. This was Red Bull missing the normal front-running control that used to define its weekends. Miami looked better. Max finished 5th. It was progress compared with China and Japan. But better is not the same as back. That is the key distinction. A 5th place can suggest the team is moving forward, but it does not restore the old fear. It does not tell Mercedes that Red Bull has regained control. It does not tell Ferrari or McLaren that Max is about to resume the old pattern. It only says the damage looks smaller. Then Canada gave Red Bull exactly what it needed. A podium. Max finished 3rd, 11.276 seconds behind Kimi Antonelli. On paper, that was the breakthrough result of the season. Red Bull finally had something clean to point at. After Australia, China, Japan, and Miami, Canada looked like the first weekend where the story could turn. But even that podium came with context. Max called it a great result. He said the team had made positive steps, but he also said Red Bull can do better, and he acknowledged that the podium was helped by problems around them, including McLaren's strategy and George Russell's retirement. That is not an excuse, it is evidence, because when the driver himself does not oversell the recovery, the result becomes more interesting. Canada was real progress, but it was not proof that Red Bull was back to being the benchmark. And that is where the story becomes bigger than one podium. The first 5 races do not show a driver in free fall. They show a champion still producing value while the team around him searches for answers. Australia reduced the authority, China added reliability pressure, Japan showed the ceiling, Miami showed partial recovery, Canada showed hope, but with a warning label attached. So by the time Max stepped onto that podium, the question was not whether he could still drive at an elite level. The question was whether Red Bull had actually started to recover, or whether Max had simply made the problem look smaller than it really was. This is where the pattern becomes clearer. Every Max Verstappen result in 2026 has two scoreboards. The first one is official, 6th in Australia, a DNF in China, 8th in Japan, 5th in Miami, 3rd in Canada. The second one is less visible but more important for Red Bull. How much of that result came from the car and how much came from Max making the car look better than it really was? That is the question Red Bull cannot escape when the results stop looking automatic. Start with Max. What fans see is a 4-time world champion still finding ways to stay relevant near the front. Even when the weekend is messy, he still gives Red Bull something to defend. A 5th place in Miami, a podium in Canada, a result that keeps the conversation alive. But what the team sees is more complicated. Because when Max produces a good result in a difficult car, it helps the championship table. It helps the public mood, it gives the garage evidence that the direction may be improving, but it can also soften the pressure on the car itself. That is the strange part. A weaker driver might expose the limitation immediately. Max can delay that exposure by extracting more than most drivers could. That does not make the car good enough. It means the driver is still valuable enough to hide some of the damage. Now look at Red Bull. What fans see is a team that finally got a podium in Canada. After the difficult opening races, 3rd place gave them something real to point at. It was not hype, it was not fake progress. A podium is a podium, but the constructors table tells a colder story. Red Bull sits 4th with 57 points behind Mercedes, Ferrari, and McLaren. Mercedes is far ahead. That gap matters because team performance is not measured by one Sunday. It is measured by how often both cars can collect points, how often the car works across different circuits, and how often the team looks like it can control a weekend. Right now, Red Bull does not have that kind of control, and that is why Canada cannot be treated like a full reset. It was a step, but a step is not the same as a return. Then there is the car itself. What fans see is the RB22 looking better in Canada than it did earlier in the season. That is fair, the car did move closer, Max said the team had made positive steps. But the evidence before Canada still matters. China brought a DNF. Japan brought 8th, Red Bull publicly admitted significant shortcomings with the package. That is not background noise, that is part of the current identity of the car. So the pattern is not that Max is fading. The pattern is that Max is now being measured without the cushion of domination, and that changes the way people watch him. When he was winning from the front, every race looked clean, too clean sometimes. The start, the tire management, the gap, the radio message, the checkered flag. It made greatness look routine, but 2026 has removed that comfort. Now when Max finishes 3rd, it does not feel like a routine podium. It feels like a question, did Red Bull find performance or did Max extract it? Did the car improve, or did the race fall into a shape that helped them? Did the result reveal recovery, or did it hide the remaining problem? That is why this version of Max is more watchable. Not because he is suddenly weaker, because the story finally has friction again. Dominance made Max look inevitable, struggle makes him look measurable, and once you see that, the whole season starts to look different. Because this is not really about one podium, one DNF, or one difficult start, it is about separation. For years, Max and Red Bull were almost impossible to separate in the public mind. The car was strong, the driver was ruthless, the team executed, and the outcome felt connected. When they won, people argued over how much was the car and how much was Max, but the answer did not matter as much because the result kept coming anyway. Now the answer matters every weekend. If Max qualifies better than the car looks, that tells us something. If he finishes higher than the race pace suggests, that tells us something. If he reaches a podium but still says Red Bull can do better, that tells us something. The car is no longer hiding the argument, it is revealing it. That is the main reframe. Max becoming less dominant does not make the story smaller, it makes the story sharper. Because in a dominant car, victory can blur the details. Everyone remembers the result, but the process becomes harder to judge. Was it the driver making the difference, or was the car giving him enough margin to make the difference look effortless? In a difficult car, the margin disappears. Every 10th matters. Every strategy call matters. Every reliability issue matters. Every rival mistake matters. And suddenly, a 3rd place in Canada can say more about the state of Red Bull than some of the wins said in the dominant years. That is the uncomfortable part for the team. When Red Bull wins easily, the whole organization shares the credit. When Red Bull struggles and Max still pulls out a result, the spotlight moves. It moves from the driver to the car. It moves from the trophy to the gap. It moves from Max to the people responsible for giving Max enough performance to win again. That is not a conspiracy, it is how Formula One pressure works. A great driver can protect a team for a while. He can rescue points, he can make a bad weekend look acceptable. He can give the public a reason to believe the comeback is close. But he cannot hide the full truth forever. At some point, the car has to stop needing rescue. That is why Canada was so interesting. It was the best Red Bull moment of the season so far, but even then it came with limits. Max was third, not first. He was more than 11 seconds away from the win. He praised the progress, but did not pretend the job was complete. That is exactly the kind of result that keeps the story alive. Good enough to create hope, incomplete enough to create doubt. For casual fans, this makes Max easier to watch because he is fighting again. The race is no longer only about whether he disappears at the front. It is about what he can still pull from a weekend that does not naturally belong to Red Bull. For hardcore fans, it is even more interesting because now every session becomes a test of extraction versus machinery. How much lap time is Max finding? How much pace is the RB22 actually giving him? How much of the Canada podium was car development? And how much was race circumstance? Those are not small questions. They are the questions that decide whether Red Bull is recovering or whether Max is covering. And there is a real difference between those two things. Recovery means the team is building a car that can fight for wins on merit. Covering means the driver is keeping the results respectable while the deeper weakness still exists underneath. That line is where the next part of the story begins. Because if Max keeps producing strong results without Red Bull becoming a consistent front-running team, then his greatness stops being a comfort. It becomes pressure, pressure on the car, pressure on the garage, pressure on the people who have to prove that Canada was not just a good weekend, but the beginning of something real. And that is the question Red Bull now has to answer. Not whether Max Verstappen is still elite. The question is when elite driving stops being enough to protect the team from the truth. So this is the proof. Not one result, not one quote, not one bad weekend. The proof is the way every piece now points in the same direction. Max Verstappen is still producing results that keep Red Bull in the conversation, but Red Bull is not yet producing a car that makes those results feel inevitable. That difference matters. Start with the performance proof. In Miami, Max finished 5th. In Canada, he finished 3rd. Those are serious results in context, especially after the DNF in China and 8th place in Japan. But neither result looked like the old Red Bull pattern, no full race control. No weekend where the field looked trapped behind the same answer. No feeling that Red Bull had returned to being the team everyone else had to chase. Canada was the best sign so far, but even there, Max finished more than 11 seconds behind the winner, Kimi Antonelli. That is close enough to feel like progress, but not close enough to call control. Then comes the team proof. Red Bull is 4th in the constructor standings with 57 points. Mercedes is leading with 219. Ferrari and McLaren are also ahead. That table matters because Formula One is not only a driver championship story, it is an organization test. One Max podium can lift the mood. It cannot erase the gap across the garage, across different tracks, and across the opening phase of the season. That is why the team picture is colder than the driver picture. Max can make a Sunday look respectable. The constructors table tells you how much work the team still has to do. Then comes the statement proof. After Canada, Max did not sell the result as a completed comeback. He said the team had made positive steps. He called the result good, but he also said Red Bull can do better. That is the important balance, not panic, not denial, progress with the limitations still attached. And that is why this version of Max is so watchable, because every good result now carries pressure with it. If Max finishes 5th, the question is how much higher the car should have been. If Max finishes 3rd, the question is whether Red Bull found real pace, or whether Max turned a limited weekend into a stronger result than the car deserved. If Max keeps doing that, the danger for Red Bull is subtle. He can protect the team from looking worse, but he can also make the real problem harder to measure. A slower driver might expose the weakness immediately. Max can cover it for a while, he can rescue points, he can keep hope alive. He can make a difficult car look like a developing car. But Formula One eventually separates hope from performance. At some point, the car has to win because it is fast enough, not because Max makes the race look cleaner than it was. That is where the future gets uncomfortable. If Red Bull improves from here, Canada becomes the first clear sign that the recovery was real. But if Red Bull stalls, Canada becomes something else. It becomes the weekend where Max made the problem look smaller. And that is the tension going forward. This video is never really about Max becoming less special. It was about the opposite. When the perfect Red Bull disappeared, the job Max was doing became more visible. The dominance made him look inevitable, the struggle made him look measurable, and now the question moves away from the driver, because if Max is still this good, then the mystery is not Max Verstappen anymore. The mystery is Red Bull, so the next question is the one Canada could not fully answer. Is Red Bull actually coming back, or is Max Verstappen just making the damage look smaller?